Usually when we picture a historical moment that completely changes the trajectory of the world, there's this ingrained expectation of volume.
Oh, absolutely. Like a movie climax.
Right. You imagine a loud, aggressive disruptor just shouting down the opposition.
Yeah.
A fiery speech that physically shakes the walls and a crowd just roaring in agreement.
Because we're basically conditioned to believe that historical impact requires maximum decibels. We constantly equate volume with power.
Exactly. We just assume that to move the needle, you have to be the loudest voice in the room.
Yeah.
But if you step back and look at the actual spark that ignited, one of the most important civil rights protests of the 20th century, that movie script just falls apart completely.
It really does. Because we are looking at a moment that is incredibly, profoundly quiet.
Right. Picture this. It's early evening in Montgomery, Alabama. The year is 1955. A public bus pulls to a stop, and a sensibly dressed woman in her 40s steps aboard.
And just put yourself in her shoes for a second. She has just spent her entire day bent over an ironing board.
Yeah, in a dingy, poorly ventilated basement tailor shop. Her feet are visibly swollen, her shoulders are aching.
And she sits down in the first row of the colored section and just watches the bus fill up.
And then the driver orders her to give her seat to a white passenger. And this woman, Rosa Parks, utters a single word. She doesn't scream it, she doesn't pound her fist, she just says no.
And when the driver threatens to have her arrested, her response doesn't escalate into a screaming match either. She simply says, "You may do that."
It's amazing. When she died in 2005 at the age of 92, her obituaries were filled with these fascinating, seemingly contradictory descriptions. They called her soft-spoken, sweet, and small in stature.
Yeah, they said she was timid and shy, but possessed the courage of a lion.
Right. They used phrases like radical humility.
Which really forces us to pause and ask a fundamental question about human nature, right? Like, how can a person be both genuinely shy and profoundly courageous?
Because we have this massive societal blind spot, we automatically assume quietness is a symptom of weakness or submission.
But Rosa Parks actually titled her autobiography Quiet Strength. I mean, she knew exactly what she was doing. She was entirely aware of the paradox she represented to a world that, frankly, refuses to listen unless someone is yelling.
So welcome to the Deep Dive. Today's mission is to unpack the incredibly comprehensive research by Susan Cain on the hidden power of introverts. We're taking a journey into what scientists call the north and south of temperament.
We are going to explore exactly what happens when society overvalues the loudest voices and, crucially, how the quiet ones among us can reclaim their hidden power.
Okay, let's unpack this, but I have to push back on this premise right out of the gate. Do we really undervalue introverts?
What do you mean?
Well, think about our cultural heroes. We practically worship Albert Einstein. We revere Sir Isaac Newton. We all love the trope of the solitary, eccentric genius sitting in a room, changing the world. I mean, I don't see society throwing Einstein under the bus.
That's a fair point. But what's fascinating here is the distinction between mythical reverence and daily reality. Yes, we love the idea of the quiet genius when we're looking backward at history.
Right.
But look at our actual present-day societal structures.
Yeah.
Look at the modern corporate open plan office or the elementary school classroom where desks are pushed into pods and kids are graded on participation.
Oh yeah, the pods, the absolute worst.
Right. These environments are rigorously, almost aggressively built around what psychologists call the extrovert ideal. We might love Einstein in theory, but when a hiring manager is interviewing candidates for a mid-level marketing job, the reward almost always goes to the person who talks the most.
No one who talks the fastest and the loudest.
Yeah.
So we tolerate introversion only if you happen to be actively inventing the theory of relativity.
Exactly. But if you're just a regular person trying to survive a Tuesday afternoon staff meeting, you're expected to put on a theatrical performance.
Which is exhausting.
It is, and this wasn't always the case. To understand why you and I are suddenly expected to be performers just to survive in the workplace, we really have to travel back to the turn of the 20th century.
Let's dive into that historical shift, because I think it explains so much of the exhaustion and anxiety we feel today.
Yeah, we have to look at how America transitioned from what cultural historians call a culture of character to a culture of personality.
Okay, picture the year 1902. We're in Harmony Church, Missouri. It's a tiny rural town on a floodplain. And there's this young, skinny, unathletic high school student.
He's good-natured, but he is completely crippled by insecurity.
Right. His father is a perpetually bankrupt pig farmer. This kid is terrified of thunder, terrified of going to hell, but mostly he's terrified of being tongue-tied.
I love this detail. He actually spends his time worrying that years in the future, on his wedding day, he won't be able to think of anything to say to his bride.
That is next-level anxiety. He is the living embodiment of rural 19th century social anxiety, entirely focused on his internal inadequacies.
And then a Chautauqua speaker comes to town.
For anyone who doesn't know, these were traveling lecturers, right?
Yeah.
They brought a whiff of glamour, education, and entertainment to rural America before the era of radio or TV.
Exactly. And this speaker completely captivates our young protagonist. The lecturer tells this sweeping, rags-to-riches tale of how he used to be a lowly farm boy, just like the kids in the audience.
But he developed a charismatic public speaking style and completely transformed his destiny.
And the kid is mesmerized. He goes to college, signs up for every single speaking contest, loses constantly, but keeps practicing his delivery until he finally becomes a speaking champion.
And then he leaves college in 1908, right? Becomes a traveling salesman, hawking beef for Armour and Company, and eventually lands in New York City,
where he pitches the YMCA on letting him teach a public speaking class for businessmen at night.
And that YMCA class explodes. It becomes a huge cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
Because that skinny, insecure farm boy from Missouri was Dale Carnegie.
Dale Carnegie. He goes on to found the Dale Carnegie Institute and writes the absolute foundational text of this new era.
How to Win Friends and Influence People.
That's the one. Carnegie's personal metamorphosis is the exact blueprint for America's cultural metamorphosis. In the 19th century culture of character, the ideal self was serious, disciplined, and honorable.
You were judged by how you behaved in private, not how you performed in public.
Exactly. The advice manuals of the day featured historical heroes like Abraham Lincoln, who was praised specifically for being modest and unassuming.
I remember reading about one popular manual at the time called Character, the Grandest Thing in the World. It featured a story praising a timid shop girl who secretly gave her meager earnings to a freezing beggar.
And her virtue was entirely rooted in her anonymity. She didn't want credit.
But as the 20th century rolls around, the advice manuals suddenly change.
Oh, completely. The titles shift to things like, to create a personality is power. The literature stops telling you to be morally upright and secret and starts telling you to figure out how to make people think you're a mighty likable fellow.
The focus flips entirely from inner virtue to outer charm. So, why did that happen? Why did society collectively decide that being fascinating was suddenly more important than being good?
It was driven by a massive demographic shift, urbanization. In 1790, only 3% of Americans lived in cities. But by 1920, more than a third did.
Millions of people were leaving the farms and small towns where they had interacted entirely with neighbors they had known since birth.
Right. In a small town, if you are quiet and reserved, but you are honest and you work incredibly hard, everyone knows it. Your character precedes you.
You don't have to announce your value because your lifetime of actions has already spoken for you.
But suddenly you move to Chicago or New York and you are surrounded by strangers. Your entire survival depends on first impressions.
If the foreman hiring you at the factory doesn't know your family or your work ethic, all he has to evaluate you on is how confidently you present yourself in a 5-minute interaction.
Exactly. Citizens morphed into employees. And the burgeoning advertising industry figured this out immediately and weaponized that transition.
Weaponized is the perfect word for it.
They realized that people were terrified of being judged by these new crowds of strangers, so they started preying on this new social anxiety.
Like those 1920s Woodbury soap ads.
Yes. The ones warning women that critical eyes are sizing you up right now. And Williams Shaving Cream ran campaigns telling men to let their faces reflect confidence, not worry, because it's the look of you by which you are judged most often.
I am struck by how identical that is to modern social media personal branding.
It's the exact same thing.
The 1920s basically invented the human billboard. Today, we're constantly told we need to curate this perfect, extroverted, fascinating version of ourselves for LinkedIn or Instagram. You aren't just selling a product or doing a job. You are selling yourself.
And if you don't project confidence, the assumption is that you lack competence. And the psychological fallout from this pressure was profound.
Yeah, this is the era that popularized the concept of the inferiority complex, right?
Right. Suddenly, being shy or reserved wasn't just a natural personality variation. It was a pathology. It was a medical complex that you had to be cured of.
By the mid-century, the pharmaceutical industry capitalized on this with the rise of anxiety drugs like Miltown and Equinol.
At one point, 1 out of every 20 Americans was taking Miltown. largely to cope with the sheer exhaustion and anxiety of not fitting in, of not being able to effortlessly play the role of the gregarious alpha performer.
It infected everything, even places that should have valued quiet intellect.
Yeah.
Like in the 1940s and 50s, Harvard and Yale admissions deans were openly stating that they were rejecting sensitive neurotic types.
And when you read the history, neurotic was just their coded language for introverted and intellectual.
They wanted boys with a hail fellow well-met demeanor. They wanted the loud, backslapping extrovert because that's what corporate recruiters were demanding.
Which culminates in perhaps the most visceral image of the extrovert ideal, the 1950s IBM sales force.
Oh, the singing.
The singing. Every morning, these men would gather together in a room and literally belt out the company anthem. They would sing a song called Ever Onward, singing loudly about what a glorious feeling it was to be selling IBM products, just to pump themselves up before going out on sales calls.
Just imagine the pure dread of being an introvert in that room.
Oh, it would be a nightmare.
If you are a thoughtful, analytical person whose nervous system does not enjoy singing corporate fight songs at 8 a.m., you were severely disadvantaged in this new economy, regardless of how good you actually were at your job.
That is the legacy we are still living with. The extrovert ideal convinced us that we all need to be loud, singing performers to get ahead.
Well, let's pull that thread into the present day, because it profoundly reshapes who we choose to lead us. We have this massive societal assumption baked into our brains that the loudest people are the best leaders.
Yeah, if Dale Carnegie was the prototype of this in the 1920s, the ultimate modern evolution of this hyper-extroverted leadership model is someone like Tony Robbins.
Robbins is fascinating because he represents the absolute pinnacle of charismatic, dominant leadership. He turns extroversion into a literal physical spectacle.
He really does. If you look at an event like his Unleash the Power Within seminar, it is basically an extrovert's ultimate fantasy and an introvert's deepest nightmare.
Right. It's held in a massive convention center. The air conditioning is deliberately cranked down to refrigerator temperatures to accommodate his high-octane metabolism as he runs around the stage.
And there are giant, blinding screens, pounding rock music, and thousands of people jumping up and down, high-fiving complete strangers.
And Robbins himself is this larger-than-life figure. Literally, he's 6'7", commanding the stage for 15 hours a day.
But we need to examine what is actually being taught in that environment. He is framing salesmanship and extroversion not just as useful business tools, but as moral virtues.
Yeah, the exercises involve practicing your handshake to ensure it dominates the other person.
You are taught to project maximum physical energy because the underlying implication is that if you don't project this massive dominant energy, you won't make the sale, you won't succeed, and to use the seminar's own extreme language, your family will die like pigs in hell.
That is such an intense psychological framing. It equates high-energy extroversion with being a superior, more capable, more moral human being.
And the culmination of the event is walking across a bed of 2,000-degree coals. You have to propel yourself into this fearless, dominant, screaming state of mind to conquer the fire.
And look, Robbins clearly helps a lot of people. His fans love him, and there is value in overcoming fear. But the problem is that it cements this cultural narrative that this is what leadership looks like.
Yeah.
You have to be a giant, loud, firewalking dynamo to be in charge.
But does that model actually produce the best results when it comes to managing real people in real businesses?
Well,
Let's look at how Harvard Business School, which is arguably the spiritual capital of extroversion, where students' grades depend heavily on how forcefully they interject in case study discussions. Let's look at how they teach leadership.
okay.
They utilize a famous exercise called the subarctic survival situation.
Walk us through this, because the mechanics of human behavior here are terrifying.
So the incoming students are divided into groups and told they have hypothetically crash landed in the subarctic tundra. They are given a list of salvaged items, things like an axe, a compass, a sleeping bag, a canvas tarp, and they have to rank them in order of importance for survival.
First, they do it individually.
Right, first individually. Then they come together and debate to create a group ranking. The theoretical goal is group synergy, meaning the group's collective ranking should score better against a survival expert's answer key than any single individual's ranking did.
The idea being that many minds are better than one.
Exactly. But that's not what happens. Very often, the group fails miserably. And they fail because they blindly follow the most assertive talker, regardless of that person's actual knowledge.
Wow.
In one highly documented case, a group included a young man who had extensive real-world experience trekking in the northern backwoods. He actually knew how to survive in a frozen wasteland.
But because his temperament was quiet, and he expressed his ideas unassumingly, his group completely ignored him.
They went with the ideas of the loudest, most confident speaker in the room. If it had been a real crash, they all would have frozen to death in the tundra while ignoring the one guy who knew how to save them.
Military psychologists call this the bus to Abilene. Someone initiates an action confidently and everyone just goes along with it, even if nobody actually thinks it's a good idea, simply because the person speaking seems so relentlessly sure of themselves.
We constantly confuse presentation skills with actual talent. We assume that if someone is talking loud and fast, they must know what they're talking about.
Which brings us to the research of Adam Grant, a management professor at Wharton. He noticed that the existing studies linking extroversion to effective leadership were actually quite weak, weren't they?
Very weak. Often, those studies relied on people's perceptions of who made a good leader, meaning they asked people, does this loud guy seem like a good leader? And people said yes, rather than looking at objective financial results.
So Grant hypothesized that leadership effectiveness doesn't depend on how loud the leader is, but entirely on the type of employees they are managing.
Yes, and I love the elegance of his pizza chain study.
Let's break down exactly how he proved this.
Grant and his team analyzed data from one of the top 5 pizza chains in the United States. They looked at the store managers' personality types and compared them to the store's profitability. They found that extroverted leaders did excel. Their store had 16% higher profits, but only when they were managing passive employees.
Let's define passive in this context. What does that mean?
It means workers who just want to show up, be told exactly what to do, and go home. Extroverts are fantastic at rallying passive people. They provide the energy the team lacks.
That makes perfect sense. But what happens when the team isn't passive?
When the employees were proactive, meaning the workers themselves were taking initiative, trying to improve processes, offering new ideas, the introverted leaders vastly outperformed the extroverted ones.
By how much?
Stores with introverted leaders and proactive employees had 14% higher profits than the extroverted-led stores.
Let's pause and really look at that mechanism. Why does the introvert win when the team is proactive?
To find out, Grant ran a second, highly controlled study. He had college students folding T-shirts in competing teams. Unbeknownst to the participants, each team had 2 actors planted in it.
And what did the actors do?
In some teams, the actors acted passively. In others, they were proactive. One actor would say, hey, I have a friend from Japan who taught me a much faster way to fold these. Do we want to try it?
And how did the different types of leaders react to someone else having a good idea?
The introverted leaders were highly receptive. They listened to the suggestion, watched the new method, implemented it, and their teams outperformed the extroverted-led teams by 28%.
That's a huge margin.
It is. The extroverted leaders, on the other hand, often felt threatened by the suggestion. You are so intent on putting their own stamp on things, on maintaining their alpha status in the room, that they ignored or shut down the better idea.
That is a profound insight into corporate dynamics. So an extroverted leader is like a spotlight. They shine very brightly, but they take up all the attention in the room.
Right.
But an introverted leader is like a floodlight. They step back and illuminate the team's ideas. They create this virtuous circle of proactivity because when employees feel truly heard, they work harder and generate even more ideas.
But when an extrovert shuts them down to protect their ego, the employees just give up and become passive. And history is full of these quiet floodlight leaders who achieved massive success.
Like Darwin Smith, the former CEO of Kimberly-Clark.
Exactly. He was a mild-mannered man who wore nerdy black-rimmed glasses and sheep suits. He spent his vacations doing yard work on his farm, but he possessed a fierce, quiet resolve.
He made the incredibly bold, highly controversial decision to sell off the company's traditional paper mills and pivot entirely to consumer products, didn't he?
He did. Wall Street analysts told him he was crazy. The business press mocked him. But he quietly stuck to his strategy, and Kimberly-Clark completely crushed its rivals, generating massive returns for shareholders.
Or look at Craig Newmark, the founder of Craigslist. He's a solitary, chess-loving systems engineer. He built one of the most powerful connective platforms in the history of the internet, largely from behind his computer screen, without ever needing to be a fiery public speaker.
Even Moses is a classic example of this dynamic.
Oh, that's right.
According to the biblical text, Moses was terrified of public speaking. He told God he was slow of speech and tongue, essentially begging not to be the one to lead the Israelites because he didn't have the charisma for it.
And the text says God had to pair him with his extroverted brother Aaron to be his public mouthpiece.
Moses was the deep thinker, the quiet strategist up on the mountain communicating with the divine. Aaron was the PR guy executing the vision down in the camp.
So if introverted leaders are so incredibly effective precisely because they step back and let others shine, what happens when it's time for the team to actually sit down and do the creative work?
Because we have been deeply conditioned to believe that teamwork makes the dream work.
Right. Modern corporate culture is built entirely on the premise that collaboration is the ultimate engine of creativity.
We call this the new groupthink, and it has completely consumed our institutions. It's the ideology behind open-plan offices with no walls where you can hear every phone call your colleague makes and see every time they get up for coffee.
It's the reason our schools have abandoned traditional rows of individual desks in favor of pods, where children are forced into cooperative learning for almost every subject.
The underlying belief is that innovation is fundamentally a social act.
The cultural narrative is that a stroke of genius only happens when you're bouncing ideas off 6 other people while writing on a glass wall with a dry erase marker.
But all the evidence points to the fact that this modern obsession with constant, visible collaboration might actually be killing our ability to think.
To understand why, let's trace this obsession back to its origin point, the invention of brainstorming.
Yes. In the 1940s and 50s, a highly successful advertising executive named Alex Osborne codified the rules of group brainstorming. He genuinely believed that if you gathered people in a room and removed the threat of criticism, they would generate far more ideas than individuals working alone.
He created strict rules that we still use today, right? No judging, go for absolute quantity and build on the ideas of others.
It sounds incredibly logical. If I have an idea and you add to it, the idea gets better. Every company in the world still runs meetings exactly like this.
They do. But there's a massive problem that the corporate world refuses to acknowledge.
Decades of rigorous scientific research have proven unequivocally that group brainstorming mathematically fails.
I want to dig deep into the mechanics of this. How does putting smart people in a room together make them dumber?
Okay, so in 1958, a psychology professor at the University of Minnesota named Marvin Dunnett put Osborne's theory to the test. He gathered research scientists and advertising executives from 3M.
The company famous for inventing the Post-it notes, so these were highly creative people.
Exactly. He had them brainstorm solutions to problems in 2 ways. First in groups of 4, and then completely alone. Then he compared the total output.
And what were the results?
The individuals working alone consistently produced more ideas, and ideas of equal or significantly higher quality than the groups did. Furthermore, the data showed that performance gets worse as the group size increases.
What exactly is happening in that room that shuts down our cognitive function?
Psychologists point to 3 specific mechanisms. First, social loafing. In a group setting, human nature dictates that some people will inevitably sit back and let others do the heavy lifting. They coast on the group's energy.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second?
Second is production blocking. In a room of 6 people, only one person can physically talk at a time. That means the other 5 people are forced to sit passively. While they wait their turn, they either forget their ideas or they lose the creative momentum they had.
But there's a third reason, isn't there?
Yes. The third and most profound reason is evaluation apprehension.
The fear of looking stupid in front of your peers.
Exactly. Osborne tried to banish criticism with his no judging rule, but you cannot banish human nature with a whiteboard rule. This fear is deeply neurologically wired into us.
To understand how deep this goes, we have to look at the famous Solomon Asch conformity experiments from the 1950s.
Yes, Asch brought a student into a room and showed them cards with lines of different lengths, asking them to identify which lines matched. It was a ridiculously easy vision test.
When tested alone, people got the answer right 99% of the time.
But Asch secretly planted actors in the room. And those actors would confidently, unanimously give the wrong answer before the real participant was allowed to speak.
So picture yourself in that room for a second. You are looking at a line that is clearly 3 inches long. But 5 confident people in suits right next to you all say it's 5 inches long. What does your brain do?
An astonishing 75% of the real participants went along with the group's wrong answer at least once. They conformed to the absurdity.
But for decades, psychologists debated the underlying mechanism. Were these people just consciously lying to avoid making waves, or did the peer pressure actually change what their eyes were seeing?
And how do you even prove something like that?
Right.
Well, in 2005, a neuroscientist named Gregory Burns recreated the ASH experiment, but instead of lines on a card, he used 3D shapes.
And more importantly, he put the participants inside an fMRI brain scanner while they were making their decisions, right?
Yes, and the results were chilling. When the participants conformed to the group's wrong answer, the decision-making areas of their brain, the prefrontal cortex where conscious thought happens, didn't light up.
What lit up instead?
The areas of the brain associated with spatial perception.
Let me make sure I'm understanding the gravity of this. The group wasn't just making them lie. The peer pressure literally altered their brain's physical perception of reality. The group changed what they saw.
Groups are like mind-altering substances. If you look at this from an evolutionary biology perspective, it makes perfect sense. Thousands of years ago, if your entire tribe looked at a bush and saw a tiger, but you didn't, it was safer for your brain to literally override your own eyes and trust the tribe.
If you stood your ground and said, "I don't see a tiger," you got eaten.
Our modern brains are still running that ancient software in boardrooms. And Burns found something even more important. When participants actually stood their ground and went against the group's wrong answer, it activated a small, primitive organ in the brain called the amygdala.
Which processes upsetting emotions like fear and threat.
Exactly. Burns called this the pain of independence. To the human brain, standing alone against the group registers as a literal, physical threat of rejection.
This is a massive revelation for anyone working in an office. When you force people into a brainstorming room or an open-plan office where they're constantly observed by their peers, you are subjecting them to a constant, low-level neurological threat.
Their brains are prioritizing conformity and social survival over actual creativity, which explains why the most exceptional human achievements almost always require intense solitude.
Let's look at Anders Ericsson's famous research on elite performance. This is the concept of deliberate practice that popularized the 10,000-hour rule.
Ericsson studied expert violinists at a prestigious music academy in Berlin. The defining factor that separated the elite soloists from the average players wasn't the total hours they spent involved in music.
It was the specific hours they spent practicing in absolute solitude.
Because deliberate practice is painful. It requires you to focus relentlessly on the specific things you are bad at.
You can't do that in a group class where you are playing the parts you already know to sound good. You have to be alone in a room to struggle, sound terrible, and fix your mistakes without the distraction or judgment of the tribe triggering your amygdala.
We see this identical pattern in the tech world. Take Steve Wozniak. Yes, he attended the Homebrew Computer Club meetings, which provided inspiration, but he engineered the first Apple personal computer sitting completely alone in his cubicle at Hewlett-Packard.
Working early in the morning and late at night when no one else was around. He specifically advises young engineers that they will do their most revolutionary work alone.
The data supports Wozniak completely. There was a fascinating study called the Coding War Games that looked at over 600 computer programmers across 92 different companies.
They found a massive performance gap between the best and worst programmers, didn't they?
The top performers were 10 times faster than the worst. But that gap didn't correlate with years of experience or salary or even the time spent on the project.
The single defining characteristic of the top performers was that they worked for companies that gave them privacy, personal space, and freedom from interruption.
The worst performers worked in open, noisy, collaborative environments.
This makes me view the internet in a completely different light. Wait, so is the internet essentially the ultimate introvert tool?
How so?
Well, it built massive things like Linux and Wikipedia through collaboration, but people did it sitting entirely alone in their rooms. They collaborated asynchronously, completely free from production blocking and the amygdala's pain of independence.
That is a brilliant synthesis. Online collaboration allows for the massive exchange of ideas without the neurological friction of face-to-face peer pressure. It is a form of collective solitude.
You get the benefits of the group's knowledge without triggering the brain's conformity bias. So if introverts require this deep solitude to thrive, and if their brains are so acutely sensitive to group dynamics, we have to ask why.
Right. Is introversion just a learned preference?
Yeah, is it a habit they picked up because they read a lot of books in childhood, or is it hardwired into their actual DNA?
To answer that, we have to look at the biology of temperament. A developmental psychologist at Harvard named Dr. Jerome Kagan ran a longitudinal study that completely revolutionized how we view human personality.
Starting in 1989, right?
Yes. He gathered 500 four-month-old infants in his lab. He exposed these babies to a series of carefully controlled novel stimuli. He played recordings of strange voices. He popped balloons in front of them.
He waved alcohol-soaked cotton swabs under their noses. He just subjected them to a barrage of sensory input.
Right, and he meticulously observed their physical reactions. About 20% of the babies reacted vigorously to the new sights and sounds. They thrashed their arms and legs, they pumped their limbs, their heart rate spiked, and they cried loudly.
And he categorized them as high reactive.
Another 40% of the babies were low reactive. They stayed calm, relatively quiet, maybe moving their limbs slightly, but basically unfazed by the popping balloons and strange smells. The remaining 40% fell somewhere in a middle spectrum.
Now, if you asked anyone on the street to predict the outcome of this study, normal logic would betray them. You would assume that the babies kicking and screaming and making a huge racket would grow up to be the loud, aggressive, extroverted adults, and the calm, quiet babies would become the introverts.
But Kagan found the exact opposite.
Wait, really?
Yes. When he followed up with these exact same children at ages 2, 4, 7, and 11, the thrashing, crying, high reactive babies had grown up to be cautious, quiet, introverted kids.
And the calm ones.
The calm, quiet, low-reactive babies had grown up to be relaxed, confident, thrill-seeking extroverts.
Walk me through the biology of this. Why on earth does a screaming baby become a quiet adult?
It all comes down to the amygdala, that same emotional processing center we talked about with the conformity experiments. The amygdala functions as the brain's alarm system.
So the high reactive infants were thrashing and crying because their amygdalas were incredibly biologically sensitive to new information.
Exactly. A popped balloon or a new smell sent their nervous systems into immediate overdrive. As they grew older, this highly sensitive nervous system meant they felt physically overwhelmed by crowded rooms, loud noises, and new people.
So they adapted. They became quiet, careful, and sought out low-stimulation environments, like a library or a quiet bedroom, to keep their highly sensitive nervous systems balanced.
Their introversion isn't weakness. It is a protective strategy against a world that feels neurologically too loud. They are managing their bandwidth.
Precisely. The low-reactive babies, however, were born with sluggish amygdalas. It takes a massive amount of external stimulation to get their nervous systems to register excitement.
So as they grow, they actively seek out thrills, crowds, loud music, and novelty just to feel a baseline level of neurological engagement.
And this biological divide extends far beyond just how we process fear or loud noises. It also governs how we process pleasure, ambition, and reward, doesn't it?
Yes, through the dopamine system. Dopamine is the feel-good neurotransmitter associated with reward-seeking behavior. Extroverts have a highly active dopamine reward system.
How does that compare to introverts?
Let me give you a metaphor. Imagine the introvert's dopamine system is like a person drinking from a garden hose. A little bit of reward, a good book, a quiet conversation is enough to satisfy them.
Okay.
The extrovert's dopamine system is like a massive water tower. A garden hose won't fill it. They need a fire hose of stimulation. When an extrovert anticipates a massive reward like making $1 million, gaining huge social status, or winning a massive gamble, their brain floods with dopamine. They get a literal intoxicating high from chasing the prize.
Which explains why extroverts make incredible salespeople and charismatic leaders.
Yeah.
But it also reveals a massive, dangerous blind spot.
That dopamine buzz can be so powerful that it physically blinds extroverts to potential risks. They become so laser-focused on the shiny object that they ignore the warning signs flashing around them.
Financial researchers point to the 2008 Wall Street crash as a prime example of this biological mechanism run amok, right?
Absolutely. The culture of high finance heavily selected for reward-sensitive, dopamine-driven, hyper-extroverted risk takers. They were so intoxicated by the anticipation of massive payouts that they completely minimized the catastrophic systemic risks of subprime mortgages.
Whereas introverts, with their garden hose dopamine threshold, don't get that same blinding buzz from external rewards. They are much more capable of remaining objective, seeing the risks, and putting on the brakes.
This also explains why introverts are incredibly persistent. If they aren't relying on a dopamine high to keep them motivated, they can just grind through the tedious hard work.
Like Adam Grant's study of the call center telemarketers.
Yes, he found zero correlation between extroversion and cold calling success. The extroverts would make a few great calls, ride the dopamine high, but then completely lose focus the minute a new distraction appeared or they hit a string of rejections.
The introverts, however, would just quietly plow through rejection after rejection, dialing the phone over and over, because their motivation wasn't dependent on a neurochemical thrill.
So we have this profound biological divide. High reactive introverts who process the world deeply and cautiously, and low reactive extroverts who seek out rewards and massive stimulation.
But evolutionary biology rarely leaves things to chance. Why do high reactive people exist if they are so easily overwhelmed? This brings us to the orchid hypothesis, which I think is the most beautiful concept in all of this research.
The orchid hypothesis is a stunning piece of evolutionary theory. It suggests that highly reactive individuals are like orchids. If you plant an orchid in a harsh environment, it wilts quickly. It gets sick, suffers depression, and fails to thrive.
Highly sensitive children who grow up in abusive, stressful, or neglectful homes often have terrible outcomes compared to their peers. They internalize the stress deeply.
They are biologically vulnerable to bad soil.
But if you plant that exact same orchid in a highly nurturing environment, a greenhouse with the right light, the right soil, and supportive caretakers, it doesn't just survive.
It blooms spectacularly. It wildly outperforms the hardier, less sensitive dandelion children. The research shows that highly reactive kids raised by supportive, understanding parents often grow up to be exceptionally empathetic, highly creative, deep-thinking leaders.
Their biological sensitivity, when nurtured, becomes their greatest superpower. Because they feel things deeply, they notice nuances others miss. They process complex information thoroughly.
They develop incredibly strong, rigid consciences because they deeply fear doing the wrong thing. Evolution kept the orchid genes around because a tribe needs both the fearless warrior to hunt the mammoth and the sensitive strategist to notice the subtle change in the weather that signals a coming winter.
I am fascinated by this, but I have to ask the uncomfortable question. Here's where it gets really interesting. If I am an orchid, and my biology dictates my highly sensitive amygdala, my lower dopamine buzz, my physical aversion to public speaking or crowded rooms, am I just doomed? Do I have no free will?
That is the crucial question, and the scientific answer is absolutely not. We are not prisoners of our biology. We have an incredible human capacity to stretch our personalities beyond our biological baselines, thanks to a framework developed by Professor Brian Little called free trait theory.
Brian Little's personal story is the perfect vehicle to explain this. He is a massively introverted man, yet he would deliver these wildly passionate, highly extroverted, standing room-only lectures to his Harvard students.
He looked like the ultimate alpha extrovert commanding the stage, but afterward his nervous system would be so overstimulated by the performance that he literally had to run and hide in a bathroom stall.
Pulling his feet up so no one could see his shoes.
Exactly, just to lower his biological arousal levels back to normal.
Professor Little's life proves that introverts are perfectly capable of acting like extroverts, and vice versa, when it is in the service of what he calls core personal projects.
Let's break down what a core personal project is for the listener. A core personal project is work you consider deeply meaningful, or a relationship with someone you love desperately.
For Brian Little, he loved his students. He cared deeply about teaching psychology. That was his core project.
Because the project mattered so much to him, his brain was able to temporarily override his biological preference for quiet, and he could summon the massive energy required to perform on stage. But there is a non-negotiable biological catch.
The bathroom stall.
You can stretch your temperament like a rubber band, but you cannot snap it. If you spend too much time acting out a character without a break, you invite massive burnout, emotional exhaustion, and physical illness.
Your immune system will eventually crash. You must balance the exertion of a free trait with what Little calls a restorative niche.
A restorative niche is the physical or temporal place you go to return to your true self. It's the bathroom stall. Or it's taking a walk entirely alone during your lunch break instead of eating in the cafeteria.
Or choosing to answer emails for an hour instead of making exhausting phone calls. It's all about finding your sweet spot of optimal arousal. Everyone, regardless of personality type, has a specific level of stimulation where they feel most alive, capable, and comfortable.
Right.
Let me offer an analogy to make this tangible for the listener. Imagine you are lying in a hammock on a beautiful Sunday afternoon reading a fantastic novel. The temperature is perfect. You are perfectly, optimally stimulated. You are deep in your sweet spot.
Okay, sounds great.
But after a couple of hours, you start rereading the same paragraph.
Yeah.
You're getting antsy. The novelty is worn off, and you are now understimulated.
Your arousal level has dropped too low, so what do?
You call a friend and go out for brunch. You ratchet up the stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
You're chatting over coffee. The environment is lively. The food is good. And boom, You are back in your sweet spot.
Right.
But then your friend drags you to a massive, loud, crowded block party. The music is blasting, strangers are bumping into you. You have to shout just to be heard.
And suddenly, your high reactive amygdala starts firing warning signals.
Yes, you have blown right past your sweet spot and are now severely overstimulated. You feel exhausted, irritable, and desperately want to go home.
The secret to a successful, sustainable life is designing your daily schedule so you spend as much time in that sweet spot as humanly possible while utilizing restorative niches when you are forced out of it.
Let's look at a practical example of this. Esther, the tax lawyer. Esther is a deep introvert. She started her career doing corporate litigation, which is a gladiator-style, aggressive, highly confrontational field.
She hated every second of it. She was constantly overstimulated, terrified of the aggressive posturing, and miserable. But instead of leaving the law entirely and throwing away her degree, she found her restorative niche within the profession.
She switched to tax law.
Because tax law is a quiet, analytical, math-like puzzle, she gets to close her office door, dive deep into complex tax codes, and do the quiet, solitary intellectual work she thrives on. She completely redesigned her environment to fit her biological sweet spot.
And this is something every listener needs to apply to their own life. You have to actively identify your own core personal projects.
Look back at what you genuinely loved doing as a child before the world told you what you should like. Look at the tasks you naturally volunteer for at work when no one is forcing you.
Pay attention to what you secretly envy in others. Jealousy is an ugly emotion, but it is an incredibly accurate map of your true desires.
Once you identify those core projects, you'll know when it is actually worth the physical exhaustion of acting out of character, and you will know exactly when you need to fiercely protect your boundaries and retreat to your restorative niche.
How does this internal biological balancing act play out when we collide with others in the real world? Like in different cultures, in our marriages, and when raising kids?
We have to start by zooming out and acknowledging that the extrovert ideal is a Western construct. It is not a universal human truth. In many Asian cultures, for example, the ideal is completely inverted.
The research looks closely at high schools in Cupertino, California, which has a heavy Asian American population.
Yes, the cultural norm instilled by their parents is intense study, a profound respect for quietness, and a deep aversion to bragging or aggressive self-promotion.
But these kids are living a brutal double consciousness. They deeply respect the quiet values of their families, but they know they are competing for college admissions and jobs in an American system that ruthlessly rewards loudness and self-promotion.
Which represents a tragic societal misunderstanding of how power works. The research introduces the Asian concept of soft power. If the Western extrovert ideal is leadership by fire loud, consuming, dominant, aggressive soft power is leadership by water.
It is quiet, relentless persistence. Water doesn't beat you up. It slowly, relentlessly wears away the rock until it wins.
Mahatma Gandhi is the ultimate embodiment of soft power. He was terrified of the dark as a child. He was terrified of other people. He hated public speaking so much his vision would blur.
But he used that shyness not as a weakness, but as his shield and buckler. His power didn't come from a booming voice or physical dominance. It came from an unshakable inner conviction and quiet, relentless, unyielding persistence.
This clash of styles, fire versus water, high reactive versus low reactive, also plays out intimately in our homes, particularly in romantic relationships between introverts and extroverts.
Let's look at the classic dynamic of Greg and Emily. Greg is a classic low reactive extrovert. Emily is a high reactive introvert.
And they are having the quintessential Friday night fight. Greg wants to host a big dinner party with lots of friends. Emily has been working all week and just wants a quiet night in with him or maybe one other couple.
So Greg gets frustrated and throws out the classic insult. He calls Emily antisocial.
Which is a completely scientifically inaccurate label. Introverts are not antisocial. They are differently social. Extroverts like Greg seek out socializing as a forum for social impact, a way to expend their abundant energy and get that dopamine hit.
They thrive on the intense neurological multitasking required to navigate a loud cocktail party.
People don't realize that a dinner party is actually exhausting physical work for the brain. You have to listen to the person in front of you, formulate a response, read their microexpressions, monitor the group dynamic of the room, and actively block out the background noise.
Greg's low-reactive brain loves juggling all that data. It fills his dopamine water tower.
But Emily's high reactive brain, her sensitive amygdala, gets completely overwhelmed by that flood of sensory data. She prefers one-on-one conversations where she doesn't have to multitask.
Where she can use her natural introvert gift for deeply decoding social cues and having meaningful, intimate interactions. She isn't rejecting people. She is biologically protecting her sweet spot.
So how do they fix it? Do they just fight every Friday until they get divorced?
They need to establish what Brian Little calls a free trade agreement.
Yes. It's a structured negotiation. They agree to host a dinner party once every 2 weeks. This satisfies Greg's biological need for social impact and dopamine.
But, as part of the agreement, Emily gets to retreat to her bedroom at 10 p.m. without any guilt and without any complaints from Greg, giving her the restorative niche she needs to lower her arousal levels.
A free trade agreement. That is incredibly practical. And this deep understanding of temperament is even more crucial when we look at how we raise the next generation.
We talked about the orchid hypothesis earlier. Parenting is the greenhouse. How do we make sure our quiet kids actually bloom instead of wilting?
First and foremost, we have to stop trying to turn our orchids into dandelions. The child psychologist Dr. Jerry Miller explicitly warns against telling a shy child to come out of their shell.
When you use that phrase, you are inherently implying that there's something wrong with their natural shelter, that their biological need for safety is a defect.
I think about Jim, a father mentioned in the research. His highly sensitive daughter was incredibly cautious and fearful of new situations. Instead of doing what society tells us to do, pushing her into the deep end to toughen her up, he incrementally introduced her to new environments.
If she was scared of joining a new soccer team, he wouldn't force her onto the field. He would take her to the park and just let her stand on the sidelines and watch.
He let her watch until her highly reactive amygdala realized there was no actual threat. He validated her fear, let her process the novelty at her own pace, and praised her quiet strengths like her deep empathy and strategic thinking.
Validating a child's feelings rather than dismissing them is the most powerful tool a parent has. If you understand the biology, if you realize that your child isn't being stubborn or difficult, but that their nervous system is genuinely physically overwhelmed, you change your entire approach to parenting.
You help them find their own sweet spot rather than forcing them into yours.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let's retrace the massive journey we've been on. We started in the historical shadow of the extrovert ideal, watching a young Dale Carnegie invent the culture of personality, which fundamentally altered society and forced us all to become human billboards just to survive urbanization.
We dismantled the dangerous myth of charismatic leadership, seeing clearly how quiet, proactive, enabling leaders like Darwin Smith often outlast and outperform the loud, spotlight-stealing ones.
We debunked the massive corporate lie of the new groupthink, proving through fMRI scans that the human brain requires deep, solitary focus to achieve true creativity, free from the amygdala's primal fear of social rejection.
We looked under the hood at the actual biology of human temperament, understanding how our dopamine receptors and our reactive amygdalas physically shape whether we crave the energy of a stadium crowd or the sanctuary of a quiet library.
And ultimately, we discovered the incredibly liberating truth of free trade theory. We are not trapped by our biology. We can stretch ourselves to achieve our core personal projects as long as we respect our biological limits and aggressively build restorative niches into our daily lives.
We can navigate our marriages and raise our children with a profound new empathy for the quiet power of the orchid.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. There's an old story about a man who dies and goes to heaven. He has always been fascinated by military history, so he asks St. Peter, who was the greatest general who ever lived?
St. Peter points to a man sitting quietly in the corner and says, "There he is."
The man looks and says, "Wait, I knew that guy on Earth. He wasn't a general. He was a humble, quiet cobbler who made shoes."
St. Peter replies, "Yes, but if that cobbler had been given the right environment and the right opportunity, he would have been the greatest general in history."
It is a profound reminder of the massive, untapped human potential hiding in plain sight, silenced by a noisy world. Think about the cobblers in your own life right now.
Think about the quiet kid at the back of your child's classroom. Think about the soft-spoken colleague who rarely speaks up in your brainstorming meetings.
Think about your spouse who slips away early from the dinner party. What if they're the greatest generals, the profound innovators, just waiting for a culture that finally stops shouting long enough to listen to them?
And more importantly,
what if the most profound, world-changing idea you will ever have is simply waiting for you to close your door, turn off your notifications, and finally enjoy the silence?